Thank you very much. In fact, I would like to try to set some of the context for the discussions we're about to have by speaking to some of the realities of the energy sector and the trends that we see in that sector. But first, to say just a word about the global carbon cycle. As you know, the gases that we're talking about have very long lifetimes, atmospheric lifetimes. 100 years or longer in almost every case, but for methane. And that means that the act of emitting is, for all intents and purposes, for the present generation, and even perhaps the next, essentially an irreversible act. And it also means that it's going to take a long time, having therefore emitted, to return to levels that we might find more amenable to our expectations about the climate around us. Now, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has looked at scenarios going out, in particular for 450 parts per million. All the governments in the IEA region and the major economies have all endorsed the concept of moving to 450 parts per million by the end of the century. That's associated with a 50-50 probability of having no more than a 2-degree increase in the global mean temperature. Well, they've looked at scenarios to get there, and there's a couple of points that are important when we're looking at climate mitigation. First is that for 450, every scenario that we see takes us by the end of this century to nearly net zero emissions of carbon. For all intents and purposes, we're going to have to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And in fact, some people are now looking at, well, alternative scenarios that are even lower that would take us into negative emissions, that is, sinks would be greater than emissions. So this is I think this is the simplest way to think about the problem that faces us. We hear lots of presentations and speeches papers about how complex and difficult this problem is. Actually, it's fairly simple. We have a capital structure. It emits a lot of carbon and other greenhouse gases today. By the end of this century, we must take that existing capital structure that we see all around us and fundamentally transform it into at least transform its emissions profile to one that's nearly net zero. More alarmingly, from the point of view of trying to reach the lower scenarios, the lower levels, is that emissions would have to peak globally by 2020. So, and of course, again, what makes this a difficult problem is not just the inertia that exists in the climate system, but the fact that there's inertia in our capital structure as well. Yes, appliances may last only about 15 years, but power plants last 15 years or even longer. At least the site may be, the site certainly stays there. We rarely see sites go away. Once they're in, once they've been taken care of in a regulatory fashion, the NIMBY problems have been dealt with, they don't go away. They may go from coal to gas or some other technology. What they do not become, by and large, is renewable technologies. They do not become solar arrays. It's inconsistent with that. So again, renewable technologies, in the absence of closing down the sites, renewable technologies are going to have to penetrate into the new demand. And of course, transforming the infrastructure of a city, the transportation infrastructure of a city, is a century-scale problem. So capital lasts a long time, and so it's not so easy to make changes. In fact, if capital only lasted 5 years, we wouldn't be having this discussion. This would be a lot simpler problem. Of course, we wouldn't be as wealthy either, but fundamentally, it's this long-lived nature of the capital structure that presents the mitigation problem. Well, how are we doing? Well, on November 10th, the next version of the World Energy Outlook 2009 will come out. We have made we have made available to climate negotiators in Bangkok a few weeks ago an excerpt on what the energy implications are for the climate problem, and that's what I'm going to report on a little bit today. But one of the things you see is that with policies in place as of July of this year, the reality is that the fossil fuel present that we see is the fossil fuel future. With existing policies, we're going to a fossil fuel future. And especially if one takes out the recent financial crisis, the reality is you don't see a lot of change in the nature of emissions. And in spite of the fact that we know countries have taken lots of actions. I mean, we have a European emissions trading system. We have China with an aggressive energy efficiency policy and policies in other countries. And nevertheless, if you looked at the track in, for example, 2080, in the 2008 World Energy Outlook, there was virtually no change in the path. It pretty much went up. Why is that? Well, that's because the world energy order is changing fundamentally. In the 1970s, when the IEA countries formed the IEA, they were not just the dominant consumer, they were the marginal consumer. They drove the determination of market price. That's no longer true. The surge in energy demand is now occurring outside the IEA region. It's occurring in the major economy meetings, major economies in China and India. And accommodating that reality is, of course, going to be critical for climate change. But, of course, it has important governance implications because the reality is every day IEA countries become less powerful, relatively speaking. Obviously, we're still the dominant consumer. That doesn't change, and we're still going to be very powerful in the future. But relatively speaking, the world is changing. But what you see in the 2009 WEO, which accommodates the realities of the financial crisis, is that there's been a significant drop in the projections. That there's a significant drop, about 35 gigatons of carbon will be saved by the financial crisis that we're now living through between now and 2030. But what happens is that eventually we will return to 2030, in 2030, to roughly the same path we would have been on in 2008, unless we take more aggressive policy. So we have a window of opportunity in some sense, where policy has a new opportunity to reach 450 parts per million if we move aggressively. Now, what needs to happen in Copenhagen, therefore? What does this imply for our governance structures? What do we have to see happen in Copenhagen and perhaps in other places? And that's an argument I'd like to make here. Well, one of the things, of course, is that we're going to have to change to using cleaner technologies. So we're going to have to affect those investments in the capital structure. And what I want to make sure we understand, which is not fully appreciated many times in the climate discussions, is that we have to do that both with respect to the new builds, the greenfield plants. That definitely is the case, and that's the way most people think about this problem. But we also have to address the existing capital structure. We need policies to address that. Now, of course, price will be an important lever in making those things happen, but price will not be enough. Price will not be enough because there are market failures. We will still have to have other kinds of support in order to make those changes happen.